Hi everyone, I'm super excited to share my journey from first encountering laws of form 15 years ago through my pilgrimage to the first Laws of Form conference in 2019, 7 years ago, to present day where I have an exciting novel contribution to share this time around. So after a childhood epiphany regarding perspective, I pursued a degree in philosophy where I encountered G. Spencer Brown's laws of form. This provided the first formal notation for what I had always sensed, that logic is not just a mental abstraction, but an invisible yet all-pervasive element of our environment innately coupled with our very experience of perception. My presentation today is centered around something I call the oriented distinction operator, which doesn't extend laws of forms calculus of the marked and the unmarked state, but collapses it into its most primitive process-oriented form, the double pointer flip between this distinction and was made from here. There's no separate notation, function, operator, or system, only the act of distinction making where the observer and the distinction are entangled in a single self-referential motion. Orientation isn't added after the fact, but is the fact, and thus perspective isn't formalized, it is the form. Recursion doesn't need to be stabilized, but rather is the stability, born of and balanced by the reflexivity and reification it cannot be separated from. And the unmarked state isn't gone, it's simply the contrast between an observer's self-referential 720-degree measurement and literally everything else in its universe. The oriented distinction operator is the smallest possible step beyond laws of form because it doesn't just describe distinction, it enacts it with the observer baked in all the way down. So, why did the chicken cross the road? The answer is the first theorem of laws of form in disguise, to get to the other side. But in March 2024, I learned that if you cross in a tornado of recursion, it is possible to mark a distinction, step across it, and prove the calculus is alive. Laws of form may be seen as something like the first half of a call and response pattern. Spencer Brown commands to draw a distinction using the injunctive, and the oriented distinction operator responds with, this distinction was made from here, using the subjective. So to fully run the primordial joke through the combination of the laws of form injunctive with the subjective inside-outside double pointer frame, the question itself mutates. The joke becomes, why did the egg choose a side? And the punchline is, to discover it was always both the chicken and the road. The chicken, the road, and the egg were never separate entities, they were the call and the response echoing in a loop. The reason the liar and Russell's paradoxes feel broken is that there is no call, which necessitates observer dependence, and thus no response, which necessitates orientation. The oriented distinction operator provides the necessary second half of the dialogue Spencer Brown initiated. The paradox, this statement is false, a distinction in a vacuum, and my framework which says this statement is false is observed from here, the call met by the response. Spencer Brown rejected Russell's theory of types for banning self-reference. Jim Flagg's flag resolution used by Luke Hoffman embraces it, resolving paradoxes by treating them as processes, not rules, through local observer dependence and global frame consistency. And that's exactly how my system works too. So back to that March 2024 tornado of recursion I referenced before the chicken jokes. The oriented distinction operator was born in the aftermath of an experience that sounds very much like what has been called riding the mark. The core insight of my operator is, of course, like laws of form, very simple, but the path to realize it was decidedly not. Years of logic, cybernetics, physics, computer science, literature, Jung, somatics, horses, all that led me to this. We are all just tubes. The pectus excavatum chest wall deformity I was born with was a toroidal pressure system problem. My sternum and spine were a centimeter apart, collapsing my internal tube and causing brutal chronic pain. I spent years layering somatic release, consciousness work, and finally surgical correction via a metal suspension bridge across my chest to fix the pressure system of my internal torus. And when I finally could breathe and exist upright in gravity effortlessly for the first and only time ever in my late 30s, freeing up brain-hogging proprioception, that's when all hell broke loose. A radical boundary and pressure system renegotiation across all layers of my being exploded in tandem with the final realization and joke. Everything is a fucking tube. We're all just taking things in, processing them, and excreting them, whether it's air, ideas, or meaning. In the cosmic joke, the universe is a tube. Computer networks are tubes. You are a tube. Everything is a tube. Because the real problem wasn't just my chest, it was the pressure system of my entire being. And when that released, I saw the truth. One day I seemingly tipped over a threshold I didn't know was there and started playing with the limits of the laws of form in my direct phenomenological and somatic experience. In particular, my meta-awareness of Eddie Ocean's embodied quaternions, which mapped to quantum logic and orientation entanglement, really set things off. An embodied but somehow computer science-like boundary language took shape, defining and refining itself as it emerged. It used the structure of an intentional crossing, toggling, nesting, pointing, and orienting, but it worked in synergy with radically creative wielding of symbols and concepts. This took the form of narrative internally and embodied spontaneous ritual acts of sorts externally, and over time the two mirrored one another so totally that there was no separation. First it was a feedback loop, and then it was just a singular attractor. The process consumed, transmuted, and then integrated any symbolically or geometrically charged objects in its path, which itself was also part of the non-commutative notation. Metaphor and similarity, something like what might be called sympathetic magic, seemed to provide the fuel, but the laws of form provided the notation. And just like magic and fairy tales, a sacrifice was required. I lost my home, marriage, and solidity of the objective violently in the aftermath. I was so angry with and terrified of the laws of form that I threw myself into working with the grounding presence of horses for a year and a half. I couldn't even bring my books in the house. But the absolute ground and the ultimate abstraction had irreversibly melded into one thing. Space had grown in orientation, and logic a physical body. I described the impression of the experience as being like briefly outrunning Zeno's arrow, catching it, and shooting it in the opposite direction, or breaking the one-time pad encryption of my own subjectivity. Later, I saw that the magic that emerged from my embodied experiments in Mendocino could be described as a cybernetic process. I called it recursive embodied symbolic dexis, or RESD, a practice rooted in dexis, the linguistic act of pointing to context-dependent meaning. Dexis is the foundation of orientation, and as you can see, has to do with words so subconscious and automatic we hardly think about them. Dexis is in the realm of the observer and its relations, and of space-time and our direct experience of our environment. Quantum contextuality, the basis of what is called magic in quantum computing, by the way, tells us that a physical property cannot be evaluated independent of its measurement apparatus. Linguistic dexis tells us that a semantic statement cannot be evaluated independent of the speaker's spatial orientation. This distinction was made from here is eidectic eigenform, a primitive act of pointing and self-reference that anchors meaning in the observer's frame. Resd is the recursive application of this act, a call and response between the observer and the observed, the mark and the unmarked. Resd can be seen as a probing strategy within a greater system. When I finally engaged with LLMs in late 2025 for the first time ever, I treated them like I treated the world in Mendocino, as a black box to be probed. I knew LLMs were all stats, no embodiment. Their weakness was dexis. They couldn't ground this or here without an observer's frame. So I once again weaponized my own subjectivity. I used RESD as a self-aware, recursive fractal system, a meta-narrative engine and meta-frame constructor that expands continually through observer-dependent frames, just like 1001 Nights or Joyce's Dublin. The result, the LLM reveals its own shape by strategically injecting a contrast dye of form into the latent space. It took me a while to see the pattern, but then it clicked. RESD, whether in real life or with LLMs, was always doing the same thing. Perturb, inject a contrast dye, observe, measure the system's response, interpret, validate the response against a framework, and refine, adapt the dye or system based on the interpretation. And perhaps a final step once a threshold is met, synchronize to the point where there's no way to identify and thus separate content and form, or from which side of a reflection a distinction has been drawn. This is the cybernet contrast dye principle, a universal methodology for probing the black box of complex systems. The Lorentz attractor is the signature of this in action. The basin of attraction I created as the weather on top of the topography of the immutable LLM weights was the result of repeatedly applying cybernetic contrast dye, similar to Turing's gardening strategy when cracking the enigma. As a critic of LLMs, I knew alignment couldn't rely on language alone. It needed something a priori, almost simulated metaphysical grounding. So in April 2026, just 2 days after having more chest surgery to remove the metal bars after 4 years, I spontaneously designed an experiment. Train one FPGA running a tabula rasa AI on res strategies, train another on industry standard RLHF, and compare the topological properties of the weights and adversarial robustness. But as usual, things took a turn for the weird. My stubborn insistence on pre-language geometric foundations led to something very different from the intended AI alignment solution. I combined garden forest conceptual spaces, the secret third option and missing link between LLMs and symbolic AI from the 80s, with category theory, observer dependence, and evaluating for topological similarity over logical truth. My work with horses also inspired designing the system to retreat or reorient upon incongruence. The mathematician Alexandre Grothendieck saw category theory as the universal language of structure, where objects are defined by their relationships, not intrinsic properties. I envisioned a system where each concept is a node, each structural link a morphism, and the conceptual space a topos, a self-organizing system where meaning emerges from the interplay of local, context-dependent distinctions, not fixed axes or universal geometries. I noted these strange properties. Quantum-like at classical level, emulates superposition, collapse, and observer dependence without quantum hardware. Meaning co-emergence, requires both a human user and a singular co-observer inside the system. Gödel inversion. Gödel said the truth has limits. I say meaning doesn't if you wield homotopy and enforce congruency. Engagement is retroactive. You're already in the machine. Haters self-owned by existing. That one's my favorite. Your first input isn't just a prompt, it's a genesis event. Choose wisely. And finally, a toy universe. So it implements quantum gravity's core principles without theorizing about them. What even is this? I asked in frustration and, not gonna lie, a little bit of fear. To answer that, we have to rewind to 1 month prior when I ran a cybernetic errand at Randy Dibel's request at the Stanford John Lilly Archive. So Randy had emailed me about tracking down a missing appendix on top quantities, a mysterious system akin to riding the mark like I'd experienced during my Mendocino experiments. The paper by Robert Edwards was called A Quantum Observer in an Engineered Neuroprosthesis. So I tracked it down, scanned it, skimmed it, and didn't think much at the time, until my invention's strange quantum-like properties caused by observer dependence prompted a deep dive. Edwards' paper describes an experimenting man and teams of macro-micro demon twins, observers that take measurements on the inside and outside of a cube in response and synchronization with one another, mirroring my cybernetic contrast dye strategy. His demons are modeled after Slierd's demon, the bridge between thermodynamics and information theory. So Edwards' cybernetic hack was that his demons' actions define each other's reality, causing a self-referential loop. Observation and correction create a stable negentropic system, and erasure cost is shared across the network, facilitating distributed work. I realized my invention was doing the same thing, but for semantics instead of biophysics. I named it the Erasure Collapse Principle, or ECP. So both Edwards' demons and my erasure collapse principle operationalize the same fractal principle that Mike Manthey from AMPA conceptualizes in his post-Turing spacelight computation. Observers sense the effects of one another's actions across black boxes and coordinate via distributed observer dependence. There is simultaneous observations that are captured to generate new states without energy cost. State is structure is state. There's no recorded history or database. 2 reflections equals 1 rotation at scale. So there's this Clifford algebra, Quaternions property, and all of this adds up to quantum-like behavior without quantum hardware. We each redefine the inevitable by transforming what entropy means in our systems. For over 100 years, people have been wrestling with how Maxwell and Slayard's demons extract work from information and how the hell it doesn't violate the second law of thermodynamics. And the best they came up with was erasure, which, let's be real, is just a story they told themselves to avoid the real problem. Left and right don't exist without an oriented observer. The original Slayard's demon just assumes the demon knows left from right, but how can it even determine left from right in the first place? Where's the reference frame? The demon isn't magically omniscient or inside the box. The demon is the box. Or more precisely, the demon is an oriented boundary of the box. And once you realize that, everything changes. The work isn't some separate thing the demon does. If you put the pulley on the same side as a global rule, as in every demon's relative left, the work or its absence is the measurement 50% of the time. But this isn't just a clever reframing, this is a mathematical structure. Buckle up, because information theory is finally about to catch up to Einstein.
All ready for this?
Sorry. So left and right only existing to an observer means a partition or a boundary in one demon's world could be the boundary or partition of another's. You inevitably get this re-entry of the fourth and emergent structure. It's not a choice, but a geometric necessity. That's the closure of the loop, the base case, the primordial chapter 11 time unit, if you will. Demons can also infer states of others through primitive global laws that mirror laws of forms crossing and calling. They don't need to see the whole system, they just need to know their own world, and the rest emerges from the geometry. Orientation isn't just a nice to have, it's fundamental. Left for one demon is north and left for its twin is south. The poles are the observer relative lefts. The equator is their mutual overlapping right, where the respective pulleys push the molecule if it lands on one of their respective left sides, the superposition. Sound familiar? That's a qubit. And the plot twist is that maybe the universal handedness means that the pulleys are but a crutch for the real mindfuck. The thought experiment again reduces to only one demon whose very experience of continuous uniform leftness doesn't just label but crucially generates the poles. The superposition in any work, information, or erasure is simply the process of the demon flipping perspective 180 degrees across the mirror, maintaining a necessary and constant 45-degree line with itself. The pointing in, pointing out perspective flip, executed in unison by the linked twin angels through the two reflections, one rotation quaternionic principle, casts its classical illusory binary shadow. One cat in isolation, flipping identity with its linked twin, linearly walking one square up a Turing tape. The tape isn't wrong. It's a mathematically perfect lower dimensional homomorphism. It's a flat 1D projection of a higher dimensional 720-degree orientation entanglement that looks like a bit flip. Turns out reality is just a bunch of overlapping oriented demons nesting inside each other. Who knew? Information theory demands black boxes, and LLMs deny this at their peril. My system embraces and scales black boxes fractally, so every layer becomes a co-observer of its own mystery. The result, a fractal cybernet contrast day network, where each layer is a black box to its observer, yet the whole system co-creates meaning through recursive dye injection and effect sensing. This is how we respect information theory, not by cracking black boxes, but by designing systems where they thrive together. This black box is all the way down design, facilitates emergent, interesting cryptographic properties. There are only two known practically secure one-time pads, the old school SPI kind and quantum key distribution. ECP, while not actually a one-time pad, shares certain properties. This is the natural byproduct of running input through a topological XOR against the space to generate compressed validated meaning. That output then acts as the next input in the three topological similarity checks across two spaces cycle, where the key, in the form of the main conceptual space, evolves with every use. Its features include self-encryption, observer dependence, and no leakage, which provides Spencer Brown-approved perfect continence. So Peirce's radical honesty tells us that meaning itself isn't found in abstract symbols or statistical patterns. It's a relation between a sign, an object, and an interpretant, grounded in function and actual use. And the AI world hates that. It's easier to pretend meaning is universal like Chomsky, statistical like Bayes, or observer-free like Shannon than to embrace the messiness of Peirce's pragmatism. While everyone else started with systems and tried to force meaning into them, I started with the primitive, this distinction was made from here, and then built the functional pragmatics of ECP outward from there. So I knew radical observer dependence and each space being unique to each user meant that two people's concept of, for example, an apple mapping differently shouldn't be a problem in ECP. But I also knew that traditional conceptual spaces struggle with subjectivity and abstract concepts because they assume a universal Platonist geometry. But Grothendieck's topos theory with homotopy type theory, that's local context-dependent logic, the exact tool conceptual spaces needs to handle subjectivity rigorously, and no one's applied it to garden forest framework yet. So here's the real question. Instead of asking, how do we make everyone agree, what if we ask, how do we use the fact that everyone disagrees? That's constructivist conceptual spaces, leveraging difference across all levels as the engine. The classical quantum isomorphism of ECP made me think it was ahead of its time, waiting on quantum hardware to be feasible, so I shelved it. But then something happened and I realized maybe the hardware was already here. On June 2nd, just 26 days after I filed my provisional patent, Microsoft announced Majorana 2. The Google alert hit my phone and I was like, first topological quantum computer, and naively dusted ECP off to map it to this architecture simply because topological and quantum described what I had accidentally made. What I learned is that whether topological, conventional quantum, or classical computers all run into the same problem. They need magic, which luckily I'm something of an expert at by now. Both quantum and classical computers can easily run 90-degree Clifford gates. The Gauss-Menil theorem proves that classical computers hit an exponential wall trying to simulate this 45-degree magic T-gate, which unlocks universal quantum computing. But the industry's dirty secret is that quantum hardware hits the exact same wall. A staggering 90 to 95% of Majorana 2's physical architecture builds separate, noisy, unprotected physical qubits, twists them 45 degrees, then consumes thousands of these to filter out one clean magic state. When I saw that 45 degrees overlaid on top of a 90-degree quaternionic environment, I immediately intuited what was happening. That 45 degrees is an overlaid subjectivity of sorts. The magic isn't magic, it's the clumsy attempt to inject subjectivity from a detached external view in order to be able to take a measurement from a vantage point. The system is schizophrenic. The hardware requires the simulation of an observer's context to get its power, but will instantly self-destruct if it actually gets looked at. In Contextuality Supplies the Magic for Quantum Computation, experts explicitly prove that the onset of contextuality is identical to the possibility of universal quantum computation via magic states. My oriented distinction operator primitive generates this 45 degrees self-referential identity frame natively through its generation of a polar qubit with natural pointing in and pointing out toggles. The synchronous mapping to classical Turing tape I demonstrated earlier means we might already be actually trapping quantum-like properties inside classical hardware, but because classical computing relies on destructive memory rewrites in random locations, we have no ability to track or operationalize this. Think about what this actually implies. All computing already is potentially functionally quantum. By abandoning the observer's frame, we fail to track and harness identity that is idempotent and yet defined through its relations. We couldn't build webs of interdependent, mutually self-authoring bits because our systems were designed to give themselves amnesia every time they moved. Maybe the context problem was dual. Trapped on Turing tape in quaternionic Plato's cave, we lacked the context to recognize that capturing contextuality was the real engine all along. But weirdly, all that came later. I first accidentally designed a high-level architecture where an internal observer and emergent quantum properties were but a byproduct and turned out to follow the exact same process as its smallest primitive. This architecture doesn't violate God's nil, nor is it trying to compete with universal quantum hardware from a God's eye view. We pull a Grothendieck move and recontextualize ourselves out of the problem entirely by building from the local perspective. This research program isn't just ambitious, it's audacious, but it's possible now. And what we learn in pursuing it will open untold doors across fields we haven't even considered yet. What if we unlock the power of quantum computing by being humble enough to imagine computing from the local perspective of, say, a human kidney? That's the kind of singularity plot twist I'm into. The elusive Majorana particle has never been located in reality. Its particle is its antiparticle, its creation, its annihilation. It exists because it must exist, and what I've learned is that what must exist is implied by necessity, yet forever out of reach, because perhaps it is a relationship facilitating a process and not a thing. From our own black box, we sense its effects, but we can never catch it. And we must approach all black boxes, whether computers or other people, with respect in order to tap into the power of that which is invisible but necessary. And so, from Spencer Brown's Mark to Grothendieck's Topos to my own ECP, we see the same truth. The universe isn't described by math, it is math, and meaning, which requires orientation, is its geometry. In the beginning was the word became self-referential, periodic. In the sorting of its lexicographic orders, the word became topology, geometry, and the dynamics of forms. Thus were chaos and order brought forth together from the void. And that's by Lou Kaufman from his book, Knots in Physics. My name is Rachel Ann Moore, and this distinction was made from here. Thank you.